Welcome to the Fourth Corner Foundation. I'm Robert Foote Shannon, and I'm here to talk about garden design and development of this property.
I'm Jim Jackson. Bob, can you take us back to the beginning?
It's been about 50 years since I purchased it, and it initially started with a little garden on the south side of the longhouse. Eventually, over time, of course, as everything has expanded and grown, and things keep being added to as we get more ideas. There's some people who, in terms of landscape design, that I find very powerful. And we will first just go back to the notion of what the French did. What the French did when they wanted to make these formal gardens is they decided to take the patterns that were in the stained glass windows in the cathedrals and lay them on the ground. And that's what created the parterre patterns that they've used today. So the idea of taking elements of design from vertical surfaces to the ground, it doesn't seem to be particularly far-fetched. I'm a big fan of Roberto Burle Marx, one of the father of modern landscape design, who was an abstract expressionist painter. So he knew that he could do abstract expressionist painting on the ground by using these plants that had oftentimes, because of the tropical aspect there of what you can grow, had leaves of many, many colors. And so you didn't have to wait for things to flower to get colors. You could just use the leaves for magenta, then yellows and pinks and all. And he's done some incredible landscapes with that. Big blocks and large monocultured areas, as opposed to the sort of more cute kind of English gardens where you have mixture of different species altogether. So for me, the foliage color has become more important than the flower colors. So that when there's no flowers out on a given area, you still have silvers, yellow, greens, dark greens, whatever, different magentas and even pinks. In designing these gardens, it seems like, some English type gardens are fine in small pieces. But when you want to do large pieces, if you want it to be a landscape as opposed to a little garden, you need to have a different concept. You either have to have some sort of geometric order, and in a minute I can talk about the why you don't want that to be Cartesian. But you have an order that's more curvilinear and irregular, but relates to some other aspect. Then you want to think about things like water and how you relate the gardens to a water pond or water feature like a stream. The Getty Museum in L.A., the new one, has a rather brilliant system of a stream that goes down, and what he's done with the trees on the side of it and the little bridges that cross it, he's made different sounds of the water for each bridge. When it comes to that, when you come to that, you can stand and hear a different sound of the water because of the rock positions or the rock types or whatnot. And then he's planted the trees on the side in a way where they're trimmed on one side but left raw to grow on the other. So there's the notion of sort of geometric interference and then non-interference. So there's lots of things you can do like that, I think, that go beyond anything that's particularly traditional. What doesn't work here, when we did the LA, we decided we would have two bushes of lornica in boxes up near the house, which was fine, except the one side always grew much better than the other for some completely unapparent reason. Then we had two maples that are the red king crimson maples further down, sort of at the beginning of where the LA starts in the woods. And unfortunately, when the trees were just doing really well, someone ran into the tree with a lawnmower and ripped all the bark off the bottom of it, and then the tree was going to die. So we couldn't get a tree the same size, so we have a smaller tree, and it's, even though you fertilize that more in water, it's to sort of try and get it to grow to the other side, and don't do it to the other tree. They're never going to be the same size. So the idea is that, this is sort of like nature doesn't like Cartesian geometry, I think, is one of the lessons from this. And so what you see that in Versailles, or you see it in probably the much better one is before Versailles, but the model for it is Vaux-le-Vicomte. They were able to just force the plants into a geometry by simply having very small little parterre gardens where the plants never get very big. Nothing is unruly. If one plant dies, you just quick run in and put another one in. And you can create all these very beautiful geometric patterns. But it's sort of odd that you would force plants which really don't have geometric patterns intrinsically forcing stuff like that too much is kind of it's gimmicky, and it's not very sustainable because you have to put a lot of effort. As buildings were built, it seemed like there should be a path between the buildings. It wasn't just a little path in the woods. But we opened it up, and then we didn't like the idea of having everything being grass for multiple environmental reasons, not to mention visual reasons. So we decided we would fill everything with gardens over a period of time, which was quite a long period of time. When we started making the clearings, the easiest thing to do is to keep trees from growing up in them again and whatnot. After digging up the roots of the stumps and things, is to just something to hold the soil so you don't get any kind of erosion, because we are on a hill and we're at the top of the watershed. So you start with making a kind of lawn, even if it's a ragged one, and then you decide, well, how are we going to design the garden? So you want to design the garden in such a way that it has some meaning to you in relationship to your building or how you perceive it when you enter into one part of the garden, one path, or there are lots of criteria, and to create a variety, or you have maybe a labyrinth garden, you have some ponds. Over time, what we did is we decided, as we wanted less and less lawn, is to see how much lawn do we need to have someplace so you could play croquet. How much lawn do you need to have to go with mowers and tractors from one place to the other, because you certainly don't want to drive over your botanicals. So that's what we're trying to limit to now. Periodically we've expanded and built out lawns. For example, in front of the corner house, it started out to have very, very little lawns. A couple of central plantings. That house had been sold to someone who put in a little garden around a tree that was rather pathetic, but it had some species that you could use to then to multiply. And so those all got moved around the edge of the property instead, and sort of linearly to make a border with the woods, because there's always the issue, the woods, if it's raw, just keeps moving out and takes over your open space. So you want to have some sort of sense of visually a limitation and a way to suppress the edge of the growth. So basically we've kind of reduced the lawn now to, I would say, relative to the garden, it's maybe 25% lawn and 75% garden.
I'm interested in the design style of the gardens interacting with the buildings that you have here.
Look at the longhouse. The gardens there are, when we built the pool out there, then the pool had a huge circular definition, which was of the planting. So everything was designed with that being an outer circle, and then the others were the interlocking circles with the Vescia Pisces, as demonstrated in the longhouse video. And then what happens from that is whatever leftover space that wasn't woods there was one little area that had a little lawn, and then we had some open space which would be a reserve for a secondary septic drainage field if we need it, because we want to be sure we can do that. And it's far enough away from property lines, et cetera, et cetera. And then where the hill went down and where originally there was a little teeny pond, we expanded that water lily pond, and we started planting around it, planting on the bank of the pond, et cetera. So that all grew out from the house. And then on the north side of the house, which is all still woods, we had just a little zone behind that well, first of all, it was stone, and then we planted some shrubs, low shrubs that now we're thinking of changing some of them because they've gotten too tall or they're falling over or whatever. So we may rethink that, and also the path from that through the woods. We're talking about putting some understory trees in kind of a row to make a kind of lining of the path. The foundation house has its gardens based on, first of all, from the halfway across the bridge from the office part to the domestic part, where the center line of that bridge, and then extends out into a kind of classical French allée. It gets bigger as it goes. It gets wider and wider as it goes, so the lines of the allée are not parallel. They expand as it goes to the distance. And there were boxes placed along that to show that's the center line. And then off of the sides of that, all the boxes start to kind of become deconstructed to relate to curved set of shrubs and things that define the top of the hill before the land falls down. Then there's a series of different gardens as it goes down to the woods. And then beyond that, there's the pond, which also half the year is a crater because it's a vernal pond, and we don't have enough water source being at the top of the watershed. So it's not the most attractive thing all the time, so we don't really want to open that up and make that a major piece of vista, so that we keep a chunk of woods in between. So a friend of ours gave us these water lilies, which have now completely covered the pond. And I think they're very beautiful, but it's getting late in the season. There's still some flowers. There's a rock area here that comes down, and under the deck there's a membrane underneath all that to collect more water for this pond than just would fall on the pond or this hill. We just decided to put stones on it. That's what people say. What is that kind of landscape feature? So I just said, oh, that's the Army Corps of Engineer landscape feature. This is our labyrinth garden that goes around. The edging is done with the second version of pressure treated wood, which is terrible, and it's all falling apart after 6 years. So I'm really quite angry about it. This part's okay here, but other areas, maybe where it gets more water or something, are being disintegrated. The corner house gardens are quite dense and have been added to over the years, as have all the gardens. I do want to talk about this one garden bed, though. There was a huge birch tree here, and the birch tree was dying and it was overshading the building. So we cut it down, but I didn't want to dig up roots. I had roots going way, way out, so I said I didn't want to make a big mess out here. So we got this idea about making a mound over what was remnant of the stump, where we planted irises. And then we planted this philopendula around it, which would grow up, and when the irises started getting skanky, they would be flowering with these white flowers, and you can still see now they've kind of turned a little yellow because they're gone, but it's shading out the visual contact with the skanky plants. So we're trying to work on these things. We tried it over here with different plants. So there are ways you can garden and stuff where you begin to control how things change over the season, as well as, in a building, everything you do is sort of done. When it's done pretty much. When you're doing gardening, everything gets changed all the time. It's a constant issue. Oh, here's an example of change over time. In a blueberry circle. Couldn't mow in between them anymore. It's too difficult to turn a mower and everything. So I got this idea of making it the blue terrace. And we put a stone down, and then we put a juga in, which has blue flowers in the spring. So you have blue flowers in the spring and blueberries in the summer. And that's worked out quite nicely, except that now we have to start pruning the bushes. And this, which is being eaten alive by an insect that happens about every 4 years, it's a Lusomachia that likes wet feet, and it's planted in the drainage trench from the laundry from the building. And we made a little stall for it because it's kind of unruly. Oh, look, there's Stephen over here. This is Stephen. He's my partner. He's the master gardener, and he runs the garden program.
I'm not sure what you want to hear about the gardens, but here they are.
About maintenance.
Maintenance is managed with several phases. This time of year, when all of this starts to die back, we cut everything down, and then we mulch it down. We rake all the leaves up and mulch it down with that. So we have about this much leaf mulch in the fall, and in the wintertime, that will compress down to about here. Almost everything in the garden is a very hardy perennial, and it'll just push its way up through. So that will minimize the maintenance next spring and next summer, basically because it'll be mulched. Last year, we started using composted manure, which comes from a methane digester in Westminster. And so all the garden beds got a healthy dose, probably this much, really well composted manure. And I think it made a difference this year, I think. We have a demonstration garden going that was set up last spring with the Vermont Master Gardener Association, and under the instruction of Claudia West, a landscape architect, I believe, in Maryland. Mostly a pollinator garden.
This is a moss garden here. That's our only moss garden. It has perfect conditions for a moss garden, and in fact, the moss garden has escaped and is taking over the driveway, which is probably not anything that can be modified. So we'll just let it do it. When you have a garden and you're in Vermont, your woods are encroaching on your garden all the time. When I bought the property, the tallest tree was, except along the stone wall, was 15 feet. And now it's like, I don't know, we're up to that, I don't know, 50 or something. And the highest the forest gets here is 100 feet, but that's a lot of forest. So it can shade at great distances, so you have to keep on top of it. And it's expensive to have the trees cut down. It's okay, you can do it yourself if they're not going to fall on a building. I once fell on a power line one time, and that was a lesson to me of not thinking that I know exactly where it's going to fall. So it's interesting that there were no trees in here. There was just a big tree, and it was shading so much that the trees didn't grow. And they cut it this winter, but they didn't cut this one down in the winter. It was just they took all the branches off it, so there was this huge pole with a couple branches on top, so it looked like some kind of enormous, bizarre palm tree. They came back in the spring and cut it. When we cut it now, we had this huge space, and what was once a secret garden is now very visible.
You had to cut trees and do things like that. What about ground preparation? The soil quality here is not so great. What did you have to do for that?
Well, I think initially when we just had small patches, we would buy manure. I remember going and shoveling manure over at the Dutton farm and into containers and bringing them back. I didn't even have a truck. It was just a car. And I would bring them back and put them and mix them in with the soil. And of course we rototilled, which we don't do anymore. That's how it sort of got started. And then we would add some peat moss and things to give it more organic material. But so we didn't have much other choice, except, of course, we could have been chopping the leaves, which is what we've done now for many years, is we take the foliage leaves and chop them all up and add them to the soil as a mulch. But, of course, it breaks down and becomes part of the soil over time. So it's been a series of a lot of years of amending the soil that way. The only thing we buy now is we can buy manure from plants where the manure has gone through a digester to create electricity, and that comes out actually as a better fertilizer than it is when it's just raw manure. And also it has a lot of organic content to it. So that can go on too, and then also limestone where we think the soil's too acidic, which we can test for when we need to.
So how do you feel that this fits in with the ideas of sustainability?
Well, what's sustainable is taking as much as you can from where you are. If you have, for example, now we're cutting some more trees, and we have a company that comes in and cuts down the ones that we're afraid to cut ourselves because they're going to fall on the building or they're way too tall now. The smaller branches can all be chipped up, and then we're using that as organic material to add to the gardens as a mulch, and also the leaves, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't really need to import any organic material, but probably some limestone from time to time we will still have to do because we have no source for reducing the acidity level of the soils in places where we need to do it, which isn't everywhere. But I think we did the grass about 5 years ago, and that's about all we've done to the grass. Yeah, by adding a little crushed limestone, just distribute it very. Right. We do it like feeding the chickens.
Where you are in Vermont, the altitude and things things like that.
Well, here in Vermont at this altitude, which is 1,750 feet, give or take a few feet, there's massive trees. It has we have a south-facing slope, which is very, very progressive in terms of getting sun. except in the winter when the temperatures could be anything, because it doesn't matter where the sun is. It just at night it just is. It depends on your altitude, I think, pretty much.
Okay. So do you do a grass planting, or do you have high mowing ideas?
Actually, most of the time the grass just plants itself if you have a little bit of patience, because it's all seeded from the air and whatnot, and birds, and you can put some little 1 year, and then it dies grass to hold the soil for the roots, and then you can buy that seed, and then you let the sort of native grasses and things grow in. You wind up with a bunch of other weeds and stuff, but we don't really care about that. In fact, we've been planting patches of ajuga in the grass to create a secondary plant. The things like plantain and stuff, that all came over with that was not native to this continent. That came over in the boats in the 1600s when the existing grasses here were eaten all by the first animals that were brought by the colonists, and they actually were having famine and starvation because their grasses were all gone. They weren't very good grasses for this kind of use. So they had a bunch imported, but unfortunately what came with those seeds were also the seeds for many of the weeds that lots of people try and get off of their lawns, which is, of course, now an absurd thing where their lawns the size of Texas. If you put all the lawns together in the United States, they're the size of Texas. So, and you don't get any food out of it. So for all the effort that goes into it and maintaining it, it's a great absurdity.
I've heard of like high mowing,
high mowing, yeah, it's really you're doing a kind of pollinator garden. You have like sort of like a meadow, and you only mow it like twice a year, and you mow it high up. You don't cut it close to the ground. And it allows for, insects and whatnot. And of course, you got more weeds than that and whatever. And there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's in a way, it's like far superior to trying to pretend that you've got this plant that you're making it line up and salute every day. So if you want to have pollinators and whatnot, you make a meadow, and you just maybe once or twice a year you cut it back down. But the problem with this, of course, is there homeowners association issues, and there's local ordinances for lawn maintenance and whatnot, because we've all established this ridiculous system, and people really consider it to take great pride in how ridiculous their lawn actually looks.
So you have ideas about encouraging people to convert their garden?
Yeah, our program of Rescape, but it's not just visual gardens. It's also food gardens, and it's complex. It's not something that we expect everyone to turn into a hippie and do it in their backyard. We think it should be a professional program, like a farm program, where pieces of land are considered to be part of a larger group of agreed upon producers for agriculture and botanical plants. And the uses can vary from CSA type of distribution to food kitchens and sales to restaurants, etc. And I think I'd like to point out that the Indians on this continent, the native Indians, their use of land is that no one actually owns the land, and you have to share the use of the land, as well as water and whatnot, and you have to use it. No one is allowed to use the land, and in any way would prevent it from being that way 7 generations thereafter. So this seems to me to be a much more intelligent plan of land use than what we've structured in this country, and lawns have become the principal enemy in the kind of sustainability of this use of this land.
How do you feel about using gas-powered vehicles on your lawns and gardens?
Well, obviously that's if you didn't have a lawn, you wouldn't have to use a lawnmower, and in fact, you couldn't have a lawn if you didn't have lawnmowers. The first lawns were started as meadows by the mega mansions of Europe. And of course, then they were emulated by the bourgeoisie, and then eventually the working class wanted to have a little lawn too. So we all wind up trying to emulate the oligarchs for no apparent reason except to make us sort of feel better in some sort of way. And then, of course, after a while, it becomes the common object. There's a lawn. It's not It's not something evil or whatever, but if you really analyze it, it's really, I think, a horrible mistake. I mean, some amount of grass is okay, but I think that it's okay also if you're trying to attract certain insects and whatnot, and you want to have an area where you can walk and whatnot. So the lawnmower part is one of the, of course, carbon dioxide producing negative aspects of lawn mowing, not to mention the transportation of the lawnmowers to your house to do it in the truck that the mower guy has. So the alternative to that, of course, is electric mowers, but again, you're down to the same system of how the electricity is produced. If it's produced by alternate energy, it's not so bad, but also the energy has to be considered of the making of the lawnmower itself, the production of the plastics that go into it, the use of how the metals are, going from rock to becoming metal or recycled from other metals. That all takes energy, and that makes carbon dioxide. So, I mean, if you really wanted to do this, you probably ought to go back to goats or sheep or something, and then you could at least eat the mowers. There's a whole article, and it's a Scientific American article on lawns. I'll just read the one. These are some of the forces that created lawns. One is the public park movement, championed by Frederick Law Olmsted, which greatly influenced the first suburban communities on the East Coast. These communities were often modeled after parks with a communal green and additional green spaces, and often included the word park in their name, Tuxedo Park in New York and Llewellyn Park in New Jersey, for example. The adoption of automobiles and the rise of long-distance travel by train in the 1920s pressured homeowners to beautify the fronts of their homes for the sake of passerbys. Houses were intentionally built facing the rail line to enhance the scenery and experience for travelers. It's hard to imagine that now when you take the train, actually. All you look at is a bunch of rundown places. Following World War II, the federal government financed low-cost mortgages which propelled builders to create blue-collar tract housing. These establishments often featured lawns in an attempt to mimic upper-middle-class suburban development and attract residents.
Well, some of us are more advantaged, particularly, here in Vermont than others. Some would say you have, more of an advantage in being able to maintain the gardens the way you do. And you talk a little bit about what it costs and the employment it takes to do it.
Well, it depends how much you do yourself and how much other people do. Initially we didn't have anybody. We were doing it ourselves, but that was when it was much smaller and we hadn't expanded it so vastly. And then also the buildings require a lot of maintenance, and that's another issue about how much you do yourself and whatever. But okay, I would say in the last 10 years we've had 2 people hired additionally to work in the gardens they don't have to be great landscape experts because a lot of these are monoculture, so it's pretty easy to weed a monoculture. If it's not the main plant, it's a weed, take it out. But the ones where we have mixed beds, where we might have as many as 20 different species in a bed, that's harder for people to do. And so the ones who have stayed for 2 or 3 years usually are able to learn that. We tried with some woofer program the last couple of years. We're not doing it this year again. We have not found it. It's probably much better for agriculture because those are all monocultured plants. For us, people then have to learn the botanicals. They don't seem to want to do it particularly. I was told that they had an app that they could hold it over the plant and it would tell it what it was, and that turned out to be a total failure, having tested it. Less than 50% accurate with the most common plants that people have. So, and then I suggested that we had books, and they just said, well, we're not too interested in that. So that was the end of that. So I think you either have someone who's really dedicated, who has some experience to do it. That can be someone who starts out with not knowing much but learns it. Well, it's not really that difficult to learn it. It's not like learning all of carpentry or something. We're fortunate that we probably have, enough economic resources to be able to maintain what's there now, and then the foundation will definitely have enough to do it, in the future. I think this is a good approach is down here. That's why I always photograph it at different times of the year. I'd photo document stuff so that we know what worked and what doesn't work happening. I don't know. So there's a very long bed here of Stakey's, so what people call lamb's ears. It's a memorial to Indian mounds from my home state, and it represents a snake mound. That's what they used to call them. And there's a tutor over here, which is this tower, and you can see it has vines growing up, which are grapes, which have gotten out of control and are growing up into the tree. But that's the tail of the snake, and the other end of the snake is a seat. That's the head, the mouth of the snake. It grows up, it has flowers. We mohawk it. We mohawk it, leaving it so that it won't seed into the grass. Leave the top part up for a while till it seems like it's kind of ragged, and then we cut that, and all that stuff goes where it cannot seed into the grass down into the woods below the property. So this is all kind of getting going, but the white phlox are still out, and the white phlox, the chocolate eupatorium has white flowers, and the Montauk daisy shrubs have white flowers when the leaves are in their best foliage coloration. So that's sort of the end of the garden system. And we also have asters, which are about to come out now, so that'll give us about 3 weeks of some other bluish little flowers. I think we have 3 different bluish colors of those: purple, magenta, and kind of blue. This is an example about what I was talking about, that you use foliage color as part of the major part of the color, the design of your garden. And you can see the colors that are here. This is a coppery color, and there's the bird's nest spruce, and then there's the silver. So you're getting a lot of colors going on when there's nothing in bloom. Over here, these are 2 different types of physocarpum. This one's darker and more purple. This is more copper-like. So if you're really into looking at the subtleties of color, you start to see some of these things. And this is one of Stephen's projects out here, which is going to be the new secret garden. You have to kind of fight your way to get in and everything. It's pretty exciting. And we have a sculpture by Jim Jackson that's down in the woods. We don't have a lot of garden sculpture. This is our allée, our French feature that cuts down through the woods to the mountains. And it actually extends over my neighbor's property, who nicely has agreed to keep it cut down. We cut it down, and so we can see the mountains. We have, the allée starts up here, so it all splays. It gets wider as it goes down. So there's the house. It's not really the house anymore. That part of it's a house. This whole thing is office and storage. And then there's garden, of course, in front. And it goes down, there's a big pond down there that actually has water in it this time of year, which is sort of unusual because we've had a lot of rain. But because we're at the top of the shed, we don't usually get a lot of water. It's vernal. And I tell people it's the crater that killed the dinosaurs where the meteor landed. And you can see we've lined it all with plants going down there. And there's some spireas and different things that are flowering. You can see that flowered, but it's gone now. There's some vegetables here. There's everything from garlic to broccoli to a lot of tomatoes and herbs. We have thyme. And then this is decorative ground cover. I like this. Is called camo plant. We plant it here and it has all these colors. Every time we plant it somewhere else, it just is green. So I don't know what that means. There's a bunch of squashes that are overgrown because you don't use enough of them. And we have dill and different things all over the place. So, end of the season.